A city like Delhi is seeing 70 people come every hour into the city. And in Bombay, I think it's about 60. So the number of interactions are growing exponentially between each of the constituents. The boundaries are porous, and therefore we need a constant sort of approach to diagnose these problems.
We really need to think about technology, using it in a way that unlocks that ability for interaction. Everyone living in a city should look at their city and say, I belong here, there's a character, and I'm a Mumbaiker, I'm a Bangalorean, and I'm a Delhiite.
Hi, and welcome again to another episode of the City Champions podcast, where we discuss the urban challenges facing our cities and discuss possible solutions that you and I, the citizens, and the government can implement to improve the quality of our lives and of our city. For today's episode, we have Siddharth Pandit, who is the CEO of Urban Collective Action Network, and Gautham Ravichander, who leads the policy engagements for eGov Foundation. Thank you so much, Siddharth and Gautam, for being here today. Cities might seem like clusters of buildings, roads, and people, but they're actually more like living systems with interconnected parts. And when you're thinking of a particular problem in a city, you don't correlate how it's connected to everything else. We're sitting in Delhi today and we're talking about transportation, mobility, we're talking about pollution, but we don't know today what the impact of all of this is going to be on something as crucial as employment and jobs. I think the idea behind today's conversation is to navigate through the complexities of cities and how we navigate systems thinking in cities. So super excited to have you both here. And get educated on this particular topic myself. But before we sort of move deeper into, what it takes to making cities resilient and go into the complexities, I would love to know more about your personal stories and the inspiration that got you to work on this. So Siddharth, maybe we can begin with you. As someone who's navigated and seen the ups and downs of many different cities, what inspired you to actually take up this role or, become a professional in a space where you're working to make cities better?
Thank you, Supriya. Thank you for that warm introduction. I don't know if it inspired me, but I've been reflecting on my journey quite a bit. And so this is very timely. I think my earliest sort of experience of cities was because of my dad, who was a cab driver. And I experienced the entire city growing up in Mumbai, sitting in his cab on the weekends when he never had to ferry passengers around. I think I used the BST buses during my early education and while early working in Mumbai, where I could see the entire city unfolding in front of me from the window of my seat. And that fascination continued. Even when I was working in, living and working in New York and other parts of US, I used to use the buses a lot more than subway. And so that sort of inspired me to also move my career from being a technologist to working as a geographer and an urban planner. And I wanted to come back to India to see if I could make a difference, right? Unfortunately, while from the early 2010s, when I returned back to India to now as we speak, while the nature of knowledge and the nature of debate about Indian cities has gone up significantly, the quality of lives has gone down drastically, especially for the middle class and the lower income population in our society. And so my constant stress has been to bring the serious level of knowledge and expertise that lies in Indian professionals in the social impact sector, and somehow create a bridge between them and the government agencies, who I wish can now partner with them on a large scale while they are developing capital intensive projects. Meanwhile, as this is happening, my love for Indian cities has grown tremendously because of the people and the culture that resides in the cities. Awesome. And I'm happy to talk more.
Awesome. We're going to talk a little bit about, the global experience that you had with New York and compare it with what you've seen in India over the last decade. But before we go into that, Gautam, just want to understand from your perspective as someone who went to study abroad, what made you come back to India and think of this problem to solve for the world and for our country?
Sure. So I've always planned to actually come back to India. So I keep getting asked this question, so I'm handling that upfront. So I come from a Fauji family, and the spirit of service to the nation has always been there. Now, as part of this, in 1996, 1997, when I started thinking about what should I be doing, and I was in the 6th standard then, I realized that the borders were secure, It was the development of the cities, the development of the country that mattered a lot more. And so I wanted to see what countries outside were doing. So I decided to figure out a way, study abroad, come back and bring that knowledge back. So part of it was always when I went, I said, what can I learn that I can bring back? And I fell in love with the subject of economics. And when you think about economics and how that intersects with cities, cities are the leading drivers of growth, right? They actually are knowledge economies, they're innovation economies, they're leadership labs. So if you think about the fact that both Subhash Chandra Bose, Jawaharlal Nehru, Motilal Nehru have all played roles in cities. Even the freedom struggle was incepted in some ways through the fact that city leaders rose to become national leaders. And around the world, you can see city leadership actually becomes national leadership over time. So India's cities need that. They need that leadership to grow. The second thing is when you're building economies in cities, you see the fact that there are so many people who are coming up from the bottom of the pyramid and actually making lives happen, right? And my own family has gone through that. We've come from the rural parts of Tamil Nadu through the army. We've been injected into cities. We've been exposed. And over a period of time, it placed us at a place where we are fairly comfortable in life. And that growth in economic status, that growth in mental openness, the knowledge, all of that was important. So when I said that, what do I want to do next? The intersection of economics and cities was where really logically I came back to. So that's why I came back.
So just to begin with you again, Gautham, you both have, and I'll come to you, Siddharth, you both have had experience of living in and working in or studying in different cities. So if you would compare that experience to the time that you've spent in India now, so what do you see as the differentiating factor, or what are the big differences in cities outside of India and in India? And how do you see the perception of Indian cities also change with respect to a global view now? So maybe we can begin with you.
So I had the benefit of growing up a bit in Bangalore, and Bangalore was already cosmopolitan, but it started internationalizing with the growth of the IT sector. So when I saw that a lot of my classmates, a lot of my friends and people in the young professional space were already having these perspectives of tracking what's going on in New York, what's going on in Silicon Valley. It was already, you started to sense that Bangalore was a part of India, but it's also a part of the world and connected to a global economy. But when I went abroad, I think the key thing that shifted was the fact that in these cities, the systems just worked quite often, right? So roads were walkable, the metro systems worked, transportation systems worked, and also you could drink from the tap. I mean, now we are talking about drink from the tap in India, but back in 1998, 1999, 2003, we all remember Zero Bees and Aquaguards, and that was life. So just the fact that the basics of roti, kapda, makan and a quality of life that was standardized at a base level so that everyone could then try to do what they could on an individual level to come up was a huge difference. The second thing that mattered was they focused a lot on maintaining their environment. They had parks, they had a lot of heritage buildings, and they maintained that facades. Now, coming from a country with so much culture, you always were thinking about why is it that my culture is not being preserved? Why is it that the heritage that we see around us is getting demolished for these steel and glass kind of monsters, right? And when you see that there are alternative ways where you can mix the old and the new, and you can actually have this high quality of life which has all the amenities, right? Like clean water, connectivity, Wi-Fi, good internet, and still have buildings that inspire you. That made me say, Indian cities need this. Everyone living in a city should look at their city and say, I belong here. There's a character, and I'm a Mumbaiker, I'm a Bangalorean, and I'm a Delhiite, and that means something beyond just this is where I live and yahan pe kaam karta hu.
Got it. Siddharth, would you like to add something?
I mean, just to reinforce Gautam's response to that, I think when I moved, and I've lived in about 3-4 cities in the US, what has always been distinguishing for me was they have always been able to maintain their transportation network so that the load of a person commuting from workplace to home to a recreational or cultural, because they bring a sense of well-being, has been solved for. And the ability to sort of maintain your own culture, right? Whether it's food culture, theater, arts, public parks. I don't know how many of our Indian cities now have libraries. When we grew up, we had libraries that we could go, and all that has been lost, unfortunately. Coming to your answer of what's the perception of Indian cities, I think since the definitely early 2000, we have seen a lot of flow of foreign capital into Indian cities, right? And there's a reason for that, that Indian professionals in various sectors are now very highly regarded. And so instead of having them to move to multinationals origin of location of origin, they prefer to come to Indian cities and set up. And we see this. Most of the big conglomerates setting up their offshore offices in Indian cities. But that comes at a cost, right? Because our public spaces, our public goods are being there's a risk of them being given up at the pressure of this. So while our professionalism, our level of knowledge and expertise due to the flow of technology has gone up, I think there's a serious risk of our cities really not being able to maintain their infrastructure, not being able to cope with the population demand and the growth that all of this inflows come. So I hope that we are able to redress that very, very soon, actually.
So, Siddharth, what are some of the core elements of systems thinking for cities? And are there any elements which stay the same or are adapted from the traditional approaches that we've been relying on till date?
So, when you think about systems, and especially cities as systems, you have to think of the broader concepts of what the boundaries of a system are, what are the core elements in that system, and what are the nature of interactions that happens between each of these elements. Now, when it comes to cities, we see that the constituents are the same, which are the land assets, the infrastructure, the labor force, the cultural assets, the environmental assets, and the institutions, the government institutions that drive the city, right? What is different as cities are growing is the number of interactions that are happening, because on some estimates, a city like Delhi is seeing 70 people come every hour into the city, right? And in Bombay, I think it's about 60, and these are official. Unofficial, it might be very much high. So the number of interactions are growing exponentially between each of the constituents. The boundaries are porous because our cities are growing every day. They are going into the peri-urban areas and then into rural areas, right? They're spreading. And so the boundaries are very porous. And therefore, we need a constant sort of approach to diagnose these problems, give the flexibility to the problem solvers to fix these problems, and then go back into the observation phase. The current planning mechanisms, which we call as master planning, does not allow for this because they are statutory plans which are done once in every 5 years. So to overcome this, what we need to do is give flexibility to the problem solvers, which are the local communities, the area sabhas, the ward sabhas, ward samitis, to be able to solve those problems, for the government to come in with the finances and thereby facilitating this problem solving process. What also needs to increase, and this is where institutions, where organizations where Gautham works in, is to really main scale the adoption of technology. The organizations that are sort of using public data, public good to produce public knowledge that is useful for this problem solving needs to be mainstream. And finally, on the sociological perspective, we really need to build the sensitivity of safeguarding our public assets and not using them for subsidizing private gain.
Got it. We'll come to you, Gautam, a little later on the technology part, but just to stay with you on this, Siddharth, previously also we spoke a little bit about systems and cities being interconnected, and there's this term on cities being complex systems which keeps coming up, right? So how do you see complexity manifesting in our cities, and how has that understanding shaped your approach to urban development?
To think about complexity, I would like to give a very real-world example. So, if you think like of a city like Mumbai, right? A middle-class family in Mumbai has probably 4 people who live in a flat apartment of about 600 square feet, which means there's extreme sort of crowding and also paying astronomical rents or EMIs to own their house. Once the household income earner, they go out to work, then they are using public transportation, which has, by some estimates, the Mumbai trains have about 9 people per square meters. So if you can imagine a 3 feet by 3 feet sort of area and put 9 people in there, that's an extreme sense of crowding. Given this causes a lot of mental stress for people within the city, and also really drives down their economic productivity. And so most of the global cities that we now look to are sort of have acknowledged this and are trying to reverse the trend. For us in Indian cities, we are still not there yet in terms of taking proactive steps. For example, if you see an extreme cases here in Delhi, where I've lived and worked for about 10 years now, where you see that the economic centers, the job centers are pretty much segregated from the housing centers, and people spend inordinate amount of time in what we call as computative commuting, where everyone is trying to get to their destination faster and quicker than the other. So the complexity lies in the interactions and the frequency of interactions, and the actual physical space that is not available for these interactions to be diagnosed and detected.
Got it. Something very interesting and out of this conversation, but just as a thing I saw recently on the internet, was that in Japan, there are segments of people who reach early to work, and they have like slots at which they reach, right? Like early, mid, and then there's space for the people who are coming late. So they've just designed their parking lots for, commercial buildings in a way where the early risers come and they park way ahead, and they leave that space for people who are coming in late. And it's just so mindful. Like, I saw that and my mind was blown that that kind of planning actually works and reduces so much stress for people like us who are always late.
and also people talk about Tokyo to be an overbuilt city, right? But if you look at statistics, Tokyo still has about 5 times the amount of green space per person than a Mumbai or a Delhi, right? And so if you look at in our working lives, right, while we work and undergo the stresses of commuting and working, there's also avenues where you can go and decompress, and that improves your urban experience. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see how the right kind of planning can, help citizens at large through every aspect of their life. Gautam, just moving on to you here, we've spoken about the complexity that exists in our cities and solving for that complexity as well. Siddharth touched upon some of the traditional approaches and how we need to change or adapt. Anything that you'd like to add on that segment?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. When you're looking at the complexity, right? Complexity in the past has been managed through these institutions of planning, of institutional coordination, and saying, okay, we'll put a 5-year plan and then we will revisit it every 5 years. Now, cities evolve much faster than the government can catch up. So we need to really start thinking about what's working well in other places. And so, number one, if you think of the financial sector, right? There is no centralized planning, but still it works. And that's because there's a lot of ease of communication across multiple places. One way to think of this is before electronic stock exchanges, you would call a stockbroker and then you'd place a buy order, and then it all get aggregated through a bunch of human beings. And so it was very hard to participate in that. With digital stock markets, you're able to now place an order online and it's settled instantaneously, and you're able to see your real-time stock positions. And think of how that's brought a lot of people into the actual practice of engaging in the financial markets. There's no reason this can't be true for cities and for governments as well, right? So the idea is we really need to think about technology, which is already present, right? It's already there. People are familiar with it. But using it in a way that unlocks that ability for interaction, like Siddharth said, right? It's all about institutions and people in institutions interacting across porous boundaries. So we need to think about going to continuous management of cities, right? So a 5-year master plan, a 25-year master plan may not make sense. What you need is a master plan that's constantly keeping track of what's going on in the city. It's getting updated by my day-to-day movements, by your day-to-day movements, everyone's Ola, Uber, bus rides, and all of that. And then what you're able to see is, oh, hey, how's my city growing? Where do I need to start thinking about where's the problem going to come up? And then how do I solve for that ahead of time? So that's one part of it. So having the shared sources of truth where we are all sharing data, sharing our information with each other the same way that the financial markets make this happen, right? And just enabling people to transact better. The second thing that we kind of need to start thinking of walking away from is there's been this long debate about devolution and decentralization. And so first we should empower the city governments, and first we should ensure all the funds reach the bottom, and then things will change. And, we're constantly waiting for the right political decisions to be made, but people live lives every day. So what you can think about is with the fact that the technology available today, the internet, communication technology, smartphones have flattened the world. you don't really need to think of these as hierarchical institutions. In fact, you can think of this as constant communication across all these institutions and the people who live in cities, the companies, the residents, the civil society organizations, exchanging their needs and saying, what do I need? What decision needs to get taken? What funds need to be made available? And not even just thinking about the government is financing, but even the city community and the business community as being potential financiers, and saying, let's make that available. So think of a flat world rather than an hierarchical world, communicating constantly through technology, right? And that can actually change this whole debate on when will the politician give up their power and make cities the front lines, right? Yeah. And the thing is, they already are the front lines. This is where growth happens. We know this, the data proves it. Just let it happen and let that coordination happen a lot easier through ease of technology and ease of communication across all these institutional structures. So that's the second piece that I think we need to have a mindset change from. I think the third piece really is we think of how we grow as cities as being defined by what's happened in the West. But that's not necessarily the only way forward. In a lot of cases, when you think about what makes sense for India, is not necessarily the kind of housing structures that make sense for the West. I think we need to go back to thinking about, people have lived in Delhi, people have lived in Rajasthan, people have lived in Tamil Nadu, and in hot climates, they've actually had architectural styles that work for them. How can you bring these architectural styles into the future, bake them into the technology, bake technology into them so that you're able to reduce your climate footprint, so that you're able to make it easier, smarter for people to interact, and you retain some of our natural heritage. So I think we try to make these three shifts as a nation, and all of us in our specific roles, whether we are planners, technologists, government administrators, business folks, trying to make that happen together, we'll get there.
And let's stay on that a little bit, right? I think throughout the 3 points that you spoke of, connectivity, technology, adoption is something that came up again and again. And now when we speak of, digital adoption, there's one way where there's digital integration happening, right? Where there's access, you're using certain technologies for social good, you're using it for, civic engagement, you're using it for access to information and for connectivity. But then there's also an overuse. So how do you kind of balance both, and how do you live in a world, or how do you make a city still seem human, where there is an equal amount of interaction with technology, but there are some of these human elements to it as well?
So I think part of it goes back to reclaiming our public spaces, right? The whole idea is when we were growing up, there were parks, people would play gully cricket. And today you can't think of sending your kids out to play gully cricket because you're worried who will drive down the road and what will happen and all of that. You don't have the spaces where you can actually walk, enjoy a nice morning walk. If you have a car, you can get to Lodi Gardens. It's a great place to walk. But if you have to walk to Lodi Gardens, it's a challenge, right? And so this is one of those things we need to think about as how do you create these pockets of public spaces where communities come together. You can obviously use technology to plan and locate all of that, but one of the pieces should be, in a manner of speaking, how do you walk in there and disconnect from the digital? So while I believe in the power of technology, I don't think everything is technological in a solution. And a lot of times we need to think of bringing people back together and maybe put down your phone in the park and look at each other when you're walking, smiling, talking. So I think some initiatives have happened, right? I think if you think about, again, I'll go back to Lodi Gardens. Every morning, they have these yoga classes and people from all parts of the city come together. There's a community there. I see the same thing in Bangalore in Cubbon Park and all of that. But also just thinking about cultural events like festivals, hubbas, where people can disconnect from their online world, come back, reconnect with their cultural world. So a city like Bangalore has actually used hubbas and cultural events to bring people back together. You're able to understand what the culture of the city is. There is music, there is drama, there is elements of mythology, and you're learning about each other in different ways. And that actually gives you a very rich life outside of the digital world. I'm not saying the digital world does not have a rich life, but this life can also be re-enriched. And so you need to make cities more livable, walkable, community friendly. And trust me, that's not going to actually bring down the commercial kind of interest. It's actually going to improve willingness to live in cities. It's going to improve productivity, like the mental health factors that lead to improvements in economics, the public health factors that reduce your issues like diabetes and all. I don't think public health is a system of how do I have hospitals. Public health is fundamentally sanitation, water, public parks. If you are able to solve for these, then you are not worrying so much about diabetes, right? And those are the kinds of issues we need to take up front. And so cities are important to both our mental and physical health as individuals and as a nation.
Yeah. Siddharth, you spoke a little bit about the quality of life deteriorating, right, in the beginning, over the last 10 years in your work in this space. I think one of the things that we've understood from the series of conversation is that there are many different communities, or like you worded it as constituents, that play a part, right? And different people or different sets of people have to come together to solve this problem. There's government, which is a key stakeholder. There are citizens, which is all of us. There's civil society. There's technology. How do you see this there's private organizations as well. How do you see this cross-sector pollination happen to bring about this change? And how far are we from actually seeing real change on ground?
So to answer the first part of the question, right, I think there is a very distinct and unique role each of the constituents has to play, right? We touched upon the fact that the number of interactions are increasing day by day and the boundaries are becoming porous. It's very difficult for government with its limited capacity to be able to diagnose those interactions and see where the leakages are. So we have to constantly and increasingly rely on the citizens, the community groups, the civil society organizations to do that discovery process for the government, right? Which means there has to be an active bridge that has to be built. So in terms of diagnosing problems, suppose a pothole is there, suppose garbage is not being collected, that's where civil society organizations, citizen groups, individual citizens should be able to report that, right? There's a huge amount of, and we touched upon this, there's a huge amount of knowledge and expertise that the private sector and the social impact sector bring to be able to solve these problems in a very responsive, time responsive manner, right? And so therefore then that bridge has to be built again by the government. I think the government, for its role, should only be a facilitator of bringing all of these together and some finance, right? What is happening today is the government is trying to do all of these things, which is probably beyond its capacity of finances and human resources, right? There are some examples that have, I think Bangalore is a very vibrant example of citizen groups coming together, having a say, building a bridge with the government. Mumbai has done it to some level, but I think I cannot imagine that being mainstream right now. So we are very far away from. I think there is some traction in terms of going back to using municipal elections. And then again, one of our partners, Janagra, works on empowering local area committees and ward sabhas, and even Praja does that, another of our partner organizations. But we are not there yet. So there's a long way to go.
Yeah. Gautham, anything you want to add? The change that you've seen maybe with all of this coming together?
What he's talking about, right? The fact of the matter is, today, when you have digital systems running city government, you need to open them up, right? So our systems are built open by default, and so therefore a citizen anywhere can raise a complaint and it will automatically get tracked, it'll get logged, you get to see what's happening. It's gone from your phone, your complaint, to the person on the field who's supposed to address it doesn't get addressed in these matter of like 3 days, 5 days, depending on the service level benchmark set for that, it gets escalated. And so there is an element of openness that digital brings in, and that's definitely something we see. But coming back to the community point as well, what's very interesting is in places like Odisha, right? They've got this community self-help groups that have been taking ownership of rebuilding their cities. So the Mukta mission really is all about how do you create infrastructure that is local, built by locals, managed by locals, maintained by locals. So local problem solving, local solutioning, and just enabled by government. And that's again community-led. And technology plays a role in this in terms of saying, hey, this problem is there, let's prioritize it. The work has started. Hey, we verified that the work has completed, make the payments to the right contractor. So even for someone who's a daily wager, right? Typically speaking, working with government meant you would get paid after 9 months or 6 months, and now they've got that down to 9 days, and that's really massive, because suddenly you are no longer thinking about where do I go to get like this working capital loan, right? So that's the other aspect of it. And I think the third element that's starting to come up is we have already seen technology as a force for participation. Can we shape it into a place where there's informed participation? Feed data back to communities, to these area sabhas, ward committees, the community groups themselves to say, this is what's going on in your city. This is how the government is managing data around your city. And so does this make sense? Are there issues? Can you flag them? Can you raise them in terms of how budgets are managed, how works are being scheduled, works are being prioritized? This could be a great way to solve that problem that we all know, right? The corporation lays a road, then the water corporation comes and digs it up, and then they lay the road again, and then the electricity corporation comes and digs it up and lays a cable, and then that gets laid again, and then you're spending something like 9 crores on this process. Again, numbers are figurative, but if you actually just coordinate it, you could cut that down to 3 crores. You could reduce the hassle for us as citizens by saying, okay, guys, you're going to have, instead of like 6 weeks of bad roads, you're going to have 2 weeks of bad roads. Just bear with us. So that can definitely come in.
No, just continuing on that, I think it touched on and this again comes back to the question where you thought about global cities and how Indian cities are, right? One of the things that is very sort of distinct is, at least in global cities, we see a lot more ownership of the citizens of the cities, right? I think that has become that has been on a declining trend in Indian cities, right? I think we don't own our cities in that sense. When we build these bridges, we are automatically transferring the ownership to the citizens themselves, and they become more aware of not soiling the public space, not defecating, all of these things. So it's also an automatic mechanism of shifting the ownership from only the municipal back to the citizens, and therefore then them sort of taking that ownership. The other point that Gautham talked about is having multiplicity of agencies is not a unique phenomenon to Indian cities. I used to work in New York, where there was an agency whose only role was to bring all the other agencies together and set up mechanisms for them to coordinate transportation investments with housing investments. And so those kind of intermediaries or facilitating agencies need to also be built up in our cities, because then they can bring all together in a sense that what Gautam was alluding to.
I think, you both mentioned of ownership on citizens, right? And I think ownership also comes from first realizing that there is a problem or a challenge that we are facing, and then accepting that if we don't do anything about this, no one's really going to do it, right? And we have to step up and take charge. And I think at least one of the conversations that I am seeing on the internet or amongst young people today is about climate change, because it's real. You can feel it. You're living in Delhi, where the heat waves are periodically happening again and again. Even up until November, you're using air conditioners, and it's becoming increasingly hot during the day, which it wasn't. And especially with COP29 now around the corner, I think climate resilience and change is something that's going to become a mainstream talking point. And given that there is such a big overlap between, urban spaces, planning our cities better, and climate change, I just wanted to get your perspective, both of you, on what are some of the strategies that we need to prioritize to become more resilient in the face of climate change? And we could start with either of you, whoever would like to go first.
Why don't you go first?
So for me, I think the climate change question is right in our face. It's staring us in our face, but it's become expedient because we haven't done the basic things correct, right? And for me, those basic things is really acknowledge that the cities are engines of economic growth at all levels, which means we cannot ignore the informal workers, which is the street vendors, the sanitation workers, manual scavengers. These are the people who are really going to suffer from climate change. And so putting them in the center of any investment is very key. The returns to that will also help in terms of what Gautam talked about, health systems, public health, right? Secondly, the second constituent who need to be bring at the forefront are increased number of women. I had an interesting conversation with Milind from Praja, saying that there is good representation of women at the political level because of India's women's bill. But there is a very underrepresentation of women in the administrative part. And so once we start bringing in women in the government administrative part, which actually develops programs and implements them, then we are going to see a different nature of investments and different nature of, we'll see more open spaces, we'll see more public parks, we'll see more public transportation. And if those get taken care of, I think to some end, the climate change question starts getting addressed. So these are the two things that I could right now think of.
Gautam, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. We just need to understand the size of the problem. Cities around the world contribute 70% of all human-generated emissions of CO2. This is actually an opportunity. You want to solve climate change, you got to solve cities. So start thinking about things like built environment, the materials we use, the heights we build to. For example, a lot of us build houses that are maximum 2, 3, 4 stories tall. You don't need so much steel and concrete. You can actually use a lot more natural materials. Now, you can make knowledge of this available. You can actually ensure that people who build in a sustainable manner, they get property tax discounts. So more and more people will build that way. It's also environmentally more sustainable, and it's also energy-wise more efficient. So you might actually find reductions in cost. Now, nobody knows this. Everyone builds the same way. So everyone thinks, actually building sustainable is costlier, but it doesn't need to be that way. So making that information available, making the tools to actually design such houses and the plans for such houses more widely available, ensuring you're connecting the local artisans, the local workers to make such buildings come up. I think that's one definite big area that we can all work on together to solve. I think the second thing is just thinking back to green cover and walkability. If you increase green cover, it reduces heat impact, right? So by ensuring that all our cities are walkable, but also that they are covered with green cover, you're automatically going to reduce the amount of heat that we are all experiencing. But at the same time, because we are walking, we are healthier. We are actually in a place where emissions are less, and just connecting with each other on the roads and on the footpaths. It's so easy to walk by a person and smile at them. How often do you smile at people when you're behind the wheel of a car, right? Yeah. That's an issue. The third part I would really come to is to say, when we're thinking of things like climate, we need to price it better. So actions, the behaviors that actually increase climate impacts should be costed aggressively. We should not be afraid of saying that, there's a congestion tax inside Delhi, and you're welcome to own your Mercedes and drive it into the city center. It's just going to cost you 10,000 rupees every day that you do this. But you can take the metro, and that's 100 rupees. And be unapologetic about taxing bad behaviors for climate. People shift over time. We've seen this happen.
We started this conversation on what inspired you to take up this career or profession, and having gone through the entire half an hour, 45 minutes of discussing each facet of what you've seen through your entire careers. I think this is a space that now young people are wanting to explore careers in. I think when I was in college, climate wasn't a subject. Environmental education in schools had just started. We were very far from understanding what urban planning even means. But today, when I look at young people, I see that this is a conversation that they're having. In fact, a lot of them are pursuing their masters in the financing aspect of climate or economics. So for people who are starting their career in this space and who are looking at their future growing from this particular realm or area, what is that one piece of advice that you would like to give them? I know this requires a lot of resilience and patience. That's something that I've heard quite a few times. But what would you feel is super important for someone starting out here?
So for me, two things. One is, if we recognize that cities are engines of growth and economic engines of growth, then anyone who wants to work in this field should have a fundamental understanding of how urban economic theory works, right? Yeah. So that when they go and work in government agencies, when they are asked a question by the IAS, the municipal commissioners, or what kind of investment they need to do, they need to know what in the long run generates positive returns, right? So do we invest in a park or do we invest in a parking lot, right? And this is a long debate, right? Parks will obviously give a lot more additional positive benefits, right? Because your real estate values go up. So while in the short term your parking lot might generate revenue, in the long term your parks will generate a lot more on not only tangible returns but also on productivity, sense of well-being. So all the professionals should have generally a good sense of how urban economic theory works. The other thing which I increasingly have started to believe in is, I think our Indian cities are on the cusp where we will not be able to solve problems, we'll be able to only manage problems. So moving your lens from problem solving to problem management, right, becomes a very big prerogative. So building skills like risk management, storytelling, user-centered design, right? How many times have we seen our footpaths come to an abrupt stop and not considering what the user experience is like, or footpaths which are too fit because they don't even want to allow anyone to walk, right? And so having user-centered design perspective, being able to do storytelling when you're reaching out to a variety of stakeholders is very important. So I would say these are the competencies I think that professionals who want to work in this sector need to equip themselves with.
Got it. Gautam.
Gotcha. So I think definitely agree with all the skills that Siddharth has been talking about. I also think important skill to think about is the idea of consensus building, right? Ultimately, none of this is going to work unless you're able to get cities, communities, and governments together. So part of it is storytelling, but part of it is active listening, patience. You talked about resilience being important, but alongside that, there's hope, because resilience can be just, oh, it's just going to take so long, and I can be frustrated about it. But you have to wake up every morning with this joy of going out there and saying, yeah, it's hard, but it's fun to do it. It's like climbing Everest, and you will summit it. And so when you have that kind of approach of like, here's a climb that's worth doing, you will actually find people make these connections on a faster basis. So think of all these software aspects. The technical skills exist. You will get trained on them. The attitudes that matter are about co-solving, co-creating, shared stewardship, and then you kind of build that sense of community together. If you're able to do that, there's an urban community, there is a financial community, there's a climate community, but you're all the same community. And then you have within that intersection the solution. So don't think of yourself as silos. If you're living in a city, you are a city's problem solver. Take that mindset and you're part of the solution.
And just to add as the last thing is to add a gender lens. I think cannot emphasize this enough. If we had women in the higher leadership, more women, and in the bureaucracy, we would see a different nature of cities. There is enough empirical evidence that they are better resource managers, they are better decision makers, and they think of the community more than probably men do. And so having that increased participation would also be bringing a gender lens to each of your investments would really change the nature of the cities.
I love when this conversation comes up without having to ask a question on gender. So thank you for that. And I think you mentioned it on 2 different occasions before as well, right? That if women are there at a local administrative level as well, then greenscapes would increase. But thank you so much for this conversation. I think, right from starting to understand cities as complex systems to almost humanizing cities by talking about things like just smiling at each other when you go for a walk. A lot to take back from. So thank you both for joining in and for being so candid about your experiences and opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.